Today on the channel, I've invited a Jewish philosopher. His name is Dr. Andrew Pessin to defend Israel. And I'm really excited about this interview. We're actually just going to jump right in. Before we do that, since this is his first time on the show, quick bio for him if you don't know who he is. He's a philosophy professor. He also writes novels. Most recent is Nevergreen, a satirical account of campus cancel culture. He also appeared as the genius on the David Letterman show. I was actually privileged to watch a little clip of that. It was great. I've actually got it linked in the description of the video if you guys want to go check that out. But as I said, we're going to get as quickly into the meat of the topic as we can. So Dr. Pessin is very sympathetic to Israel as a Jewish philosopher. So let's get into the first question that I've got prepared for you today, which is, how do you reconcile your sympathy for the Israeli cause with the international criticism of Israel's action in the Gaza Strip, particularly in the context of civilian casualties and human rights concerns?
Well, first, thanks, Cameron. Thank you for having me on. And I do need to put in the caveat that I played a genius on TV. Doesn't necessarily mean that I am one. So in any case, thank you for your question. So how do I reconcile my sympathy with the Israeli cause with the international criticism? Well, the short answer to that is pretty simple, and I'm happy to elaborate on request. But the short answer is the vast majority of international criticism is outrageous, unjustified, and ill-founded, coming from a position that simply assumes that Jews have absolutely no rights in this land whatsoever, even to the point of they don't have basic human rights, such as the right not to be murdered. And so given my sympathy for the cause, which comes from my many years of studying this particular conflict, and of course, as a Jewish philosopher, not merely a philosopher who's Jewish, but someone who has studied Jewish philosophy and Judaism over the years, I am completely convinced of the legitimacy of the Jewish right to inhabit this land. And once one is convinced of that and is therefore sympathetic to that cause, as the various international criticisms come in general, it's usually easy to recognize them as outrageous, ill-founded, coming from a fundamental denial of Jewish rights and the legitimacy of the Israeli cause. So that's, in the broad, how I would respond to that. You said specifically, you used the example of civilian casualties. Was that right?
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
civilian casualties and then human rights concerns.
Yeah. So, that question is obviously very, very general. So it would be useful to have specific instances of specific criticism. So we could start with just civilian casualties. What we, of course, find around the world. The focus of your questions seem to be starting with sort of the Arab world, the Muslim world, and then expanding outwards into larger circles, the liberal progressive world, and then just the good old fashioned anti-Semite world. Like there's a lot of different demographics involved in here. What you'll notice is not any single, and focusing just on the current conflict, not any single one of those demographics began on Saturday or Sunday with any sort of outrage about the brutal, sadistic massacre, murder, torture, abuse of 1,300 Jewish civilians. So they're not really concerned with the rights of civilians, generally speaking. In fact, where that criticism typically comes from, it's a place where, again, Jews have no rights, not even basic human rights. And so these large demographics saw absolutely nothing wrong with chopping the heads off of little babies. And so that's the starting point of the criticism. As soon as, of course, Israel begins defending itself or fighting back, suddenly there's a concern for civilians, which really is a way of saying we have no objection when Jewish civilians are murdered, but when you start fighting back and murdering our civilians, well, now suddenly we have this concern about civilian casualties. Now we can expand on that answer quite a bit. The concern for civilian casualties, it can be presented in sort of that abstract way, or can be presented in a particular framework, like the framework of war crimes, which I believe one of the questions on your list will start to address. And then you can get into some more technical things. But let me just start by saying that if a person is actually, let's say, a reasonable neutral person, never heard of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, by the way, I prefer to call the Israeli-Palestinian Jewish-Arab-Muslim conflict, because it's that complicated, and even that description doesn't bring into play even more complications than that. It's more complicated than even that. But if you had someone who's never heard of either side, and it's just literally like this is their first exposure to it, um, and you ask any such person, right, without a stake in this conflict, a personal stake or otherwise, you ask any such person their views on, military conflict and civilian casualties, it's widely understood that in any military conflict, there will be civilian casualties. I defy anyone to give an example of any military conflict which had zero civilian casualties. It's simply not possible. And so the issue is, once you've established or believe that military activity is actually justified in a certain instance, then the question of civilian casualties becomes a lot more nuanced at that moment. There will be civilian casualties, but the question now becomes, for example, how do you weigh the civilian casualties with the legitimacy of the military operations themselves? And that's a much more complicated, nuanced question, which, of course, none of the haters of Israel and none of the haters of Jews are ever interested in looking at. They will simply say, oh my goodness, look at all the civilian casualties. Look at those bloodthirsty Jews, which is the way this criticism is usually leveled by the majority of people that are not coming to this neutrally. So civilian casualties are unfortunately inevitable. And I would hope that most decent human beings, I consider myself a very decent human being, can recognize that the death of civilians, or maybe more precisely, the deaths of non-combatants, is just one of the absolute horrible tragedies of all war. And when you do that, you ask yourself, if you want to now come back to this particular conflict, if you look at the two sides and you ask what are their targets, I think it's absolutely it's undeniable. Hamas's target are the civilians, are the non-combatants. We just saw that in full display just this past week. It's literally undeniable. And indeed, if you go back to the founding charter of this organization, which is available online, I'm happy to provide a link if people need a link. They make for 40 years, they've made no secrets that their founding charter openly endorses, calls for the murder of every Jew in the world. Their issue, Hamas's issue, their beef is not with the state of Israel or any particular Israeli policies. It's A, with the very existence of a Jewish state in this particular region of the world, and B, it's with all Jews in the world. And so for them, every single Jew in the world, non-combatant civilians, we're talking grandmothers and babies who were amongst the many, many, again, not just murdered, but tortured and mutilated targets of this past weekend. Every single Jew, non-combatant, is a legitimate target, whereas I believe it is undeniable. This takes a little bit more work because you have to be slightly nuanced, that Israel primarily, if not exclusively, targets military targets, recognizing and always having to weigh the targeting military targets with the possibility of the collateral damage of civilians. And I would argue that the overwhelming majority of casualties, overwhelming majority of casualties caused by Israel in this conflict, and now we're focusing specifically Israel-Hamas, not the broader conflict, the overwhelming majority of casualties are militants, Hamas figures, or where the targets of the operations were Hamas figures, and indeed, the civilian casualties. There's essentially no demonstrable cases where you could show that Israel was targeting civilians. Now, war is messy, war is complicated, mistakes happen, but Israel has a whole legal division. Every single target has to get approved on multiple levels, and then there's legal teams that look over these things. And many missions have been called off when it was realized that the military target did not justify the civilian casualties, et cetera, et cetera. So overwhelmingly, I believe it's demonstrable that Israel targets the militants and Hamas targets the non-combatants. So those who care about civilians, and I would hope, again, all decent people, when Palestinian, Gazan civilians die, it's heartbreaking, it's tragic. But if you want to decide who to side with in this conflict, then what you're really deciding is, do you go with the side that targets the civilians, or the side that tries to stop those people from targeting civilians? And unfortunately, civilians get caught up in that. So that's how I would at least begin to answer that question.
If I seem a little bit distracted, it's because I watched a video, I think it was on Twitter or what's now X, of a family whose one of the little girls was murdered by Hamas, and the rest of the family was sitting there trying to like comfort the other kids.
I
And
saw that. Yep.
I'm I've been very distracted by that video the past couple of days, and just talking about the subject kind of brings that up, and it's horrible.
Well, the difficult thing is to decide which one to be distracted by. Because I believe it is necessary. I've been watching pretty much every single video, and that one is amongst the least horrible, the one that you're referring to, and I could identify it immediately because at least that one isn't showing the explicit violence. It's showing that this family and these little kids just having seen their young sister be murdered in front of their eyes. But of course,
And
Hamas
then they were
in the
talking about, I mean, that's what gets me is they were talking, they were like, she's in heaven and she's in a better place. And I just
right.
can't imagine like having kids having
Oh,
to
but just
explain
focus
that.
on the kids, the savagery towards the kids. Another heartbreaking one, sort of in that family of videos, is an Israeli father. There's a video of him as he's learned that his 8-year-old daughter is dead, and he says, "Thank God," because worse would be that she's kidnapped by these monsters, and who knows what they're doing with the hostages right now. And if you think about what it what it would require for a parent to be glad their child is dead because they're suffering less. I mean, how do you move forward after that? And again, these are the tamer videos. Hamas live streamed themselves literally butchering people. Evidence is coming out now that they 80% of from the forensics teams, 80% of the bodies they're finding were mutilated or abused before death, including the people who were burned to death. So, and they filmed it, and this was all over the internet, right? So it's just the human tragedy here. That's the other side. And to them, this is a massive victory. And they're, believe me, for the first couple of days, they were just gloating exultantly over this blow they inflicted upon the Zionist enemy. But who are they targeting? They're targeting the children and the grandparents and the defenseless, and the teenagers at a rave, at a dance party, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
so if you care about civilians, then you need to decide who are you with, the side that exultantly butchers, tortures, and murders civilians and films it and gloats about it, or the side that is doing everything they can to stop that side from carrying out that operation, even at the cost of civilian casualties.
So when it comes to these subjects, there's always going to be people on both extremes, right? There's going to be people that are just like completely defending Israel, everything that they do, nothing that they do is wrong. There's going to be people who defend Hamas and say nothing that they do is wrong. What's weird is that there's a lot of actual intellectuals that are doing that. But I think most people sort of fall in the middle where they want to say, both sides have done wrong things. Where do you fit on that spectrum? I know we're kind of going off the questions here, but
That's fine. First you need to avoid. Someone just published an article, can't remember who now, in the last few days, called "The Sin of Moral Equivalency." Right? Like it's easy for the neutral person.
Was it
maybe
Sam Harris?
It was Sam Harris. It was exactly Sam Harris. Yeah, exactly. He just published that piece. Thank you. I wish I could reproduce his answer because he has the perfect answer to this. I can't quite do it, but I get where that comes from. People who, especially if they don't know a lot about all the details of the conflict, they want to sort of be neutral, and the best way to be neutral is to say, well, each side has something right, each side has something wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And so I get where that comes from, and at least in many people, it's coming from a decent, admirable place. They're trying to be fair. In the same way as I know one of your questions might, if we get to it, has to do with the two-state solution. For those people on the outside of this conflict, nothing seems more fair than the two-state solution because look, they're fighting over the land, divide it up. Then that's
Right.
what we would do. We in the West, when two siblings are fighting over something, are fine, you share it, right? So those positions come from a very, very decent place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the correct or the justified position. So if we go back to my first answer, and if one is persuaded by that, look at what they're targeting. One side targets civilians and considers it a victory when when the other side civilians are murdered. The other side's main goal is to stop that. I think that breaks the symmetry. What that tells you is, in general, by and large, the Israeli side is the more just side, the correct side, the side that a truly decent person should want to be on. Because again, look at their goal. Their goal is to stop the attacks on civilians, whereas the other side's goal is to attack the civilians. once you've established that, now, what makes this very complicated, this conflict's been going on for a long time. Let's focus on the Hamas version. So Hamas came into existence in 1987 or 1988. So that version, that part of the conflict is 40 years old. Sure, in those 40 years, a lot has happened, including, 5 wars, multiple skirmishes, uncountable number of terrorist attacks, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not the type of person who's going to say every single action Israel has ever undertaken is a good, just action, and Israel can go no wrong. Of course, mistakes are made in the course of those operations. I don't envy the decision makers in terms of like security decision makers and military decision makers. Mistakes will be made, both in operation and probably sometimes in judgments. Sometimes, specific policies really are mistaken policies and not just and not fair. So of course, I'm not going to defend every single thing, and someone can maybe find examples of things that are heinous that the Israelis did. That said, you know, in general, as we step back and look at 40 years collectively, overwhelmingly, in my opinion, almost every single thing Hamas has done is objectionable and heinous as part of the open policy. Again, this is no secret. Starts with their charter. They call for the murder of all Jews, and almost every single policy and behavior since then has been furthering that policy. Whereas overwhelmingly, Israeli policy has been defensive to stop them from murdering us. And almost every single thing they've done has been in defense of that policy. So if you step back broadly enough, yeah, I would say most of the time, almost all the time, the Israeli positions are the correct defensible positions, certainly by anyone who is fair and neutral and a decent human being. It is not the Israeli policy to eliminate all the Palestinians, eliminate all the Gazans, et cetera, et cetera. The Israeli policy is actually, can we make peace with these people and live side by side with them? That's what they're aiming for. And it's hard to do that when the other side's goal is not to make peace, but to eliminate you and destroy you. So I think that's the context in which one has to think about that question.
So I was watching a video the other day. I can't remember the source, but it was a video of an Israeli saying basically the same thing that Hamas was saying, that they want to, I mean, in their charter and everything, they want to exterminate the Jews. And Israelis, there was a video of a guy saying basically he wanted to get rid of the everyone in Hamas as well. So I think that not that that's like the official Israeli stance, or that that's what the Israeli military or defense team is trying to do, but that sentiment does exist, I think, in like at least some Israelis, like they want to almost do the same thing that Hamas wants to do.
So again, let's avoid the sin of moral equivalency. First of all, how many people are in Israel? Last census was like 8 million or something like that, of which 6+ million are Jewish. Or I'm never very good with specific numbers, right? So of course, in any group of, let's even just focus on the Jewish Israelis. Let's suppose there's, I don't know, up to 7 million Jewish Israelis. I think you're going to find a few very extreme people in there because, of course, like anywhere, especially where there's freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which exists in Israel to a very high degree, people can express these views, and there's going to be some. But you already made the first point, which is this representative of this opinion? And it absolutely is not representative of Israel. It's certainly never been part of Israeli government policy, and indeed, the large majority of Israelis, if you've just been following, the internal political issues of the past year, the large majority of Israelis are outraged at what they see as the extremism of some small percentage of the settlers and even a couple of the ministers in the government. And they express that. So overwhelmingly, Israelis are not characterized by that position, but you can't stop a few of the more extreme people. Whereas on the other side, the position of Hamas is the official government position of the governing entity. And in fact, polls show that Hamas is actually extraordinarily popular amongst the Palestinian society, and indeed part of the endless conflict between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. One of the reasons the Palestinian Authority doesn't hold elections and hasn't held elections in the 20 years since they came into power is because they all know Hamas would win those elections. So in both Gaza and the West Bank, the Hamas position is the massively popular position. Now, I
I
want
think
to
it
be
was like a
careful.
majority of those in the Gazan Strip are in support of Hamas. I can't remember
I
the
think it's
exact
more than a
figure.
majority, it's like overwhelming majority type thing. And indeed,
Mm.
in the last year, there have been a few very small protests against Hamas in Gaza, which Hamas puts down brutally because there are no freedoms in Gaza. Um, but even those people who were protesting Hamas, what they were protesting wasn't the policy of killing Jews. They were protesting they don't like the corruption Hamas. Hamas makes their life miserable, et cetera, et cetera. They were good with the killing of Jews in most cases. So that's the first thing to note. You'll find an extremist on the Jewish side, but that position is not at all representative and is in fact widely condemned by mainstream Israeli society, whereas the extreme position is the mainstream position on the other side. Maybe one more point to add, which is maybe a more dangerous point, and this is possibly behind where your question is coming from. In the last few months, there's been quite a lot of media coverage of settler violence in the West Bank, right? And of course, the anti-Israel world, which is the large part of the world, has been blaming lots of things on the settler violence and et cetera, et cetera. And let me make it clear, I do not ever condone violence towards civilians and non-combatants. That's just not acceptable. So two things to say about the settler violence, which exists. Those things happen. There's a number of episodes. One, the overwhelming majority of Israeli society condemns the settler violence. They disagree with it too. They see those settlers perpetrating that violence as extremist crazies whom they disavow. And indeed, the protests over the past year, one part of those protests was against the perception that the current government of Israel doesn't do enough to stop those settlers. So, yes, some of the settlers perpetrate violence, but again, it is not a mainstream position. It's widely condemned in Israel, openly and publicly. And second, and here's the more dangerous part, again, I do not condone violence towards civilians or non-combatants ever. That's targeting directly, aiming to target civilians and non-combatants. This is the sin that the other side is doing a lot of right now. I'm about to just at least put it on the table right now, which is one can understand this violence. Again, that does not justify it, and I condemn it. Full stop. Period. End of discussion. But now, because this is an intellectual platform, and we want to understand where this violence comes from, what is massively underreported, and it stuns me in the mainstream media, because I follow a lot of Israeli media, and of course I follow a lot of American mainstream media, et cetera, et cetera. So what I see happening literally every day in Israel and the Israeli media, the onslaught of terror from Palestinians in the West Bank directed towards civilians, literally 3 to 4 to 5 attacks every single day. You only tend to hear about the big ones when there's like a couple of people shot or killed, but literally every day it's throwing stones at moving vehicles, and these are usually bricks at vehicles moving 60 miles an hour, and people have died from this. It's throwing stones, it's Molotov cocktails, it's shooting attacks, it's rammings, it's stabbings, et cetera, et cetera. Literally, I'm not great with numbers, but in the first 6 months of the year, there were something like over 3,000 terrorist attacks directed against Israeli Jewish civilians, and the settlers are responding to that. So, if the moral equivalency says, oh my God, they both do terrible things. But if you actually look at true cause and effect in the same way we just did with Hamas and Israel with those different policies, it's extraordinarily clear that the reason the settlers are perpetrating the violence is because they are responding to and ultimately defending themselves from a much, much, much larger onslaught of violence against them. And you may have heard the slogan. It applies here and it applies in general. If the Arabs stop shooting, there'll be peace. If the Jews stop shooting, there'll be no Jews, right? And that's what's going on with the settlers, and it really captures the conflict as a whole. The violence that comes out of Israel is overwhelmingly defensive, self-defense, trying to stop the other side from killing them. The violence coming out of the other side is an effort to kill as many Jews as possible. They will call it resistance, they call it self-defense, but that's just simply a lie.
So back to the question of, is Israel at fault here? There's a question, and this is commonly brought up not against, but from detractors. They'll say that Israel's response is disproportionate. They'll even cite things like, turning off the water, turning off the power
Yeah.
to northern Gaza is like, you're basically starving out this group of people that violates international law and all this. So, what do you think about that? Do you think that the response from Israel has been disproportionate? Has it been proportionate in your view?
So this is an overwhelming question, and it's got at least two very distinct levels. There's the level of what international law actually says about such matters as proportion, and then there's the casual, informal sense of what's proportionate and disproportionate. I'm I'm not an expert on international law. I read what I read and can make reference to some of this, but uh, the first answer to that is overwhelmingly Israel's responses are not disproportionate, not at all disproportionate, certainly not in the international law sense. And to me, you could only argue they're disproportionate in the informal sense if you just fundamentally believe, again, that Jews have no rights and that not even the human right to live without being murdered. So, in the more technical international law sense, the rules or laws that govern legitimate military conflict, proportionality has not at all to do with the number of casualties on either side, which I know was buried into, I think, one of your later questions. I don't think you mentioned it here. And when people say, "Oh my God, it's always more Palestinians die than Israelis," that is a ludicrous red herring. Proportionality is a function of does the military, the legitimate military target, outweigh the civilian civilian collateral damage? That's the fundamental question. And so if you have a very, very high value target, like the leader of Hamas, he might be hanging around in his living room with his extended family. And indeed, I just before we came on the air, I just read at least just a headline that the son of the leader, who's very active in the movement, was just killed in an airstrike along with 14 members of his family. So that's all I know about that. So just bracket that for a moment. Now, if this is a high value military target, this is the leadership, or this guy is very active in the campaign right now. If he's sitting down to dinner with 14 members of his extended family, every fair minded person recognizes this is a legitimate military target. And it is he who has embedded himself in a civilian population, is using his family as human shields. It is this person who's ultimately responsible for those civilian casualties. This, if on the other hand, the target is, I don't know, a single rocket, and there's a bunch of school children nearby, then that's not legitimate. To take out a single rocket isn't going to advance the military objective. The military objective here is to dismantle Hamas and prevent its military capacity to murder Jews. Destroying a single rocket isn't going to make a dent in that. And so in that kind of case, it would be outrageous to target that rocket. And so that's when you're thinking of proportionality, that's what you have to do. What was the military target? What was the collateral damage? And what makes this really a difficult question for those of us on the outside, which are, by the way, 99% of everyone commenting on this position, is in general, we have no idea what the military targets were. We don't know what Israeli intelligence is, right? We don't know why they were bombing that tower or that building, etc. Right? And lacking that knowledge, you're literally not in a position to judge, was that somehow militarily disproportionate? If it was a very high value military target, then that merits a very large number of civilian casualties. And we can't know that. We can't know that. So the haters will just assume it's not a high value military target typically. And the not haters, like myself, I tend to give Israel the benefit of the doubt in those moments. And what justifies my position is, after every single war, and this stuff gets documented, Israelis do investigations, and they do reports, and they examine like literally every target they made, and they make judgments about where they made good judgments and where they made bad judgments, and then they change policies and procedures so that the next time, if mistakes were made, and by the way, mistakes will get made in war, this doesn't justify them, but unless your position is Israel's never allowed to fight back, mistakes will get made and civilians will be killed, will be harmed. But Israel, after every war, reviews all of its procedures, all of its targets, and makes changes to change policies to decrease the chances of mistakes in future wars. I'm willing to wager Hamas doesn't do that. When they go back after each conflict, they review procedures and figure out how they can kill more civilians as opposed to how they can kill fewer civilians. So that's the main answer focusing on the sort of the legal dimension of disproportionality. It has nothing to do with how many on which side, which is, by the way, a principle not one person ever has applied to any other war fought by any other person. Nobody says, oh, those evil Americans, they killed more Germans than the Germans killed Americans. The point of a war is to win, and one wins typically in a war by killing people. And so you can't just look at the numbers killed, because that would just indicate one side was better at it than the other, but there's no sin in that. Each side has the right to try to win the war. The crucial issue is who's targeting civilians, who's trying to keep the civilian casualties proportionate to the military targets. And without question, only Israel is that in this particular conflict. So that's the main response I would make to the disproportionality claim. We could go further if you like, but there are also other questions. So I don't know what you want to do.
No, that's fine. I actually kind of want to go off script a little bit and ask you about a sort of ethical question that's come up in my mind. I'm thinking back to these intellectuals that are defending Hamas, and I just wanted to ask, from a philosophical perspective, do you think that these American intellectuals and Hamas, do you think that they share fundamental moral principles, or do you think that they are ultimately going to come at odds? Because that's what they'll cite, is they'll say, there's some fundamental moral principle that justifies Hamas retaliating or going out and trying to defend themselves against Israel's oppression. And so, but that, once you actually get to the fundamental moral principles between the two camps, I wonder if that's where the conflict is going to start to show its head. Maybe we should start to focus more of our attention on those differences.
So that's a fantastic and deep and complex question. And in fact, just, part of my way of coping with the situation, which is unbelievably stressful for me, as it is for lots and lots of people on both sides, I assume. Given my job, I try to formulate some thoughts and write it up. So I've actually been trying to write about this very question. Before I come to it, though, you're actually, the question to which I gave that long disproportionate answer, you had one extra clause in it, and I wanted to say 2 words about it, which was, you used as the example with respect to proportionality the fact that Israel, for a little while anyway, shut off the water and the electricity to Gaza in this conflict. That was the example. And people will ask, is that somehow proportionate? So a couple of factual things. First of all, the water is apparently back on, at least in the southern part of Gaza, just factually. And second, the electricity in every single one of the wars, Hamas bombs the electrical lines that provide electricity to Gaza. And in a number of the past wars, even while rockets are still flying, Israel has sent crew members in to repair the electricity lines, and in some cases those crew members have been killed by Hamas rockets. So you get this weird situation that Israel's providing electricity to its enemy while the enemy is trying to damage those very lines. So my understanding is Hamas damaged those lines this time around again, and there's no obligation, unless you just believe Jews should all die, that says that anyone is obligated to provide anything to their enemy in combat. The idea that Israel is somehow obligated to supply food, water, or electricity to an enemy population is just outrageous and has no foundation in international, as far as I understand it. And indeed, maybe the quickest way to respond, and then we can go back to your next question. Quickest way to respond to that is to say, there is, and people, including the haters, always seem to forget this. There is another way to get the electricity and the water and the crossings. By the way, Hamas started this war by bombing the crossings because they were manned by Israeli soldiers, right? So the crossings which allow things to come into Gaza, they began the war by bombing those crossings. But the quickest way to restore everything is for Hamas to surrender and return all the hostages. And the moment that happens, the power goes on, the water goes on, the crossings reopen, et cetera, et cetera. So for those who actually care about the Gazan civilians, and remember, you should care about civilians and non-combatants. For those who care about them, you've got 2 choices. You could demand that Israel stop fighting, or you could demand that Hamas surrender. And both of those will give the right result. And it's obvious to me that if you care about the civilians, the quickest and only justifiable thing to demand is that Hamas surrender and return the hostages. And so it comes down to, Who has more responsibility for the welfare of Gazan civilians, Hamas or Israel? Especially in the context when Hamas is trying to destroy Israel and has just perpetrated the most massive, atrocious slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Who in the world could possibly say Israel has more responsibility for those civilians than Hamas does? And once you've understood that Hamas is responsible for the civilians, then if you care about them, you should be demanding Hamas surrender. So I wanted to make sure that got there. Should we go to
Gotcha.
the follow up question?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So the follow up question, which to summarize it, if I have it still straight in my head, is basically asking the question: the many academics and intellectuals, and there are many, who are just clearly siding with Hamas, do they basically share the same moral principles as Hamas? Was that basically the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it it literally tears my heart in two to say this, that the answer is yes. Why does it tear my heart in two? For many, many reasons. One, as a Jewish person who is profoundly connected to the state of Israelis and state of Israel and Israelis and the Jewish collective, the idea that so many people in the world, pretty clearly the significant majority of the people in the world, hate Jews so much that they celebrate this episode that just happened last week. And let me do say also, it I am not asking anyone to suddenly be pro-Israel. It is actually possible, and indeed quite easy, to be pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel and still condemn this atrocity. Right? The fact that, good luck finding a pro-Palestinian person who actually does that. There are one or two, but one or two out of 2 billion is not impressive. It is possible to be pro-Palestinian and condemn this atrocity. So we're looking at the people who are not condemning this atrocity, and that includes lots of Arabs, lots of Muslims, lots of left-wing progressives, and the good old-fashioned right-wing anti-Semites, right? That we're also familiar with. So this huge number of people in the world so hate the Jews that they celebrate this massacre. When it comes to the academy, the university, which I would like to say either once was, or at least once embraced the following ideal, namely that the university is a place where we seek truth. And the best way to seek truth is if the university itself as an institution is a fundamentally neutral institution, and you get people with different points of view, divergent perspectives, coming into this neutral arena and arguing it out using reason and evidence and facts and civility, which I really think is an important norm within the academy. Um, that's what the university either used to be or at least aspired to be. But in fact, it hasn't. The university has been, the academy in general, not every single place, but a lot of places, and a lot of the higher ranked places, let's say, has become gripped by an ideology over the last few decades, to the point where very few universities are actually neutral institutions. They, whichever statistics you look at, if you look at like the number of people, faculty members who identify as conservatives at most of the top universities, it's going to be a shockingly small percentage. I'm bad with exact numbers, but I want to say 10%, something along those lines. If you look at the number who are registered Democrat versus Republican, the Republicans are barely represented. You have what is fundamentally a very extreme left-wing ideology, which has gripped large swaths of the university. That's part of what's behind cancel culture, which I wrote my previous novel about, Nevergreen. This is a sort of satirical account of cancel culture. And in that context, what we're seeing, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is the rallies all over the universities that were happening. I could almost understand if the rallies were happening on day 4 or 5, when Israel's fighting back and now Gazan civilians are dying, and I understand people care about civilians, et cetera, et cetera. But the rallies were beginning on Saturday and Sunday before when Israel was preoccupied with just stopping the slaughter and getting rid of the terrorists. Already Saturday and Sunday, there were rallies celebrating this on university campuses, major campuses. The first day got a lot of attention 31, I think it was, Harvard student groups put out a statement Saturday afternoon saying all the violence is Israel's fault. So blaming Israel for literally the slaughter of babies and the kidnappings of small children. There's one, speaking of some of these videos, there's one video, it's of a little 8-year-old boy, and his parents were murdered in front of him, and then they kidnapped him. So he is alone in Gaza, a hostage, this 8-year-old boy. There's also another one, J.K. Rowling weighed in on this, because there's an autistic girl. She's about 10 or 12 years old or something like that. And she just loves Harry Potter. And she's by herself in Gaza, an autistic girl. Our youngest son has autism, and it's just, the heart shatters at the thought. The heart shatters at any child being there, even with their family, but a child there alone, and an autistic child, you cannot believe the torture that is. Saturday afternoon, 31 Harvard student groups proudly proclaiming it's all Israel's fault, that this is somehow, that the slaughter of babies and children and the kidnapping is justifiable. So what we're seeing is a large movement on most campuses which celebrates this slaughter. And so you have to ask the question, I understand when Hamas celebrates the slaughter, because in my mind, they are simply dedicated Jew murdering terrorists. So this is their thing. But people with PhDs, you had a Cornell professor was filmed at one of the rallies. I don't know when the rally was filmed at one of the rallies, saying he was watching the footage and it was exhilarating. He was exhilarated by the slaughter of babies. This is a professor of history at Cornell University, whose PhD was from Columbia, and who is the son of two Stanford professors or something like that. So what we have is professors at Ivy League universities openly celebrating the most morally atrocious act you can even begin to think of. And crickets, almost no, I mean, there's some backlash now, but that he's comfortable, says he must be gripped by some ideology which determines that this is not merely even acceptable, but an actually good thing. It's exhilarating. That's his word. It's exhilarating. He's exhilarated by chopping the head off of a baby. So then the deeper question is, and we probably don't have time to, well, maybe we could if you want, but well, what is this ideology? Because we understand the Hamas ideology, we can represent very simply, as it says in their charter, the day will come when we will slaughter every Jew on earth, right? That's their ideology. They believe it for very profound religious Islamic reasons. The academy, these professors and their many, many students, I'm talking about, some of them certainly are Muslims, but that most of them are not. So their ideology is coming from some other place, but it reaches exactly the same conclusion. And so you have what, sometimes there's, I think it's called the horseshoe theory, or sometimes called the red-green alliance. So red tends to represent left-wing causes like communism, socialism. Green represents Islamicism, like the Islamist cause, the radical extreme Islamic cause. They couldn't be more different than you can't imagine those two positions being more different than radical Islamism and communism, but they come together in a horseshoe because there's one thing they agree on, which is destroy the Jews, right? And we're seeing this today. The ideology is a little bit different as it takes its shape on campuses today, but in the end, it is an ideology which justifies the extermination of Jews. And when I say that, it's not even provocative or controversial to say that, because just look at what we've seen on campuses this past week. Massive rallies where professors are speaking and not a single word of condemnation about these things. Instead, they're exhilarated by it and calling for more. So the short answer to your question is, oh my God, yes, these professors have exactly the same moral compass as these radical Islamists who have dedicated their lives to exterminating the Jews.
So if you don't mind me pushing back a little bit on that, I just find it so hard to believe that these Harvard professors, these, as you say, Ivy League professors, are in support of just killing the Jews. Like the Jews are just not valuable. Just kill them. I find it very hard to believe that that's their fundamental moral principle. It seems like they would justify it in terms of well, these actions that Hamas has undergone are justified by some other more fundamental moral principle, like self-defense, maybe. something like that. You know what I mean? So it just, I find it very hard to believe. And maybe I'm not familiar enough with what's really going on.
Yeah. So, there'll be a whole spectrum of people. So there will be some on that end who are, more moderate, more approaching what I would consider something like moral decency. And then there's going to be the more extreme. So the way to think about it is, in my view, nothing could possibly justify this atrocity. And to make that case, let's roll the tape. Begin by looking at the footage, and documenting the atrocities that were committed there. You might believe, like I said earlier, I'm not asking people to be pro-Israel. You can still be anti-Israel. You think that Palestinians have been oppressed, maybe even to the point where you think that Israel should be removed or eliminated and replaced with, like, so a Peter Beinart, for example, a CUNY professor, who's amongst the deeply, deeply confused people that you will come across, in my opinion. But his position is he believes, kumbaya, a binational single state where everybody has the same equal rights. And of course, on paper, that's a beautiful thing. That's what the United States wants to be, at least in principle, although we see from recent years that very few people believe the United States has achieved that. But at least on paper, the United States is supposed to be this multicultural state where with complete equality slash equity for all. And so that's, a Peter Beinart on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His solution is a single binational state with complete equality amongst its citizens. So, you've got that there. But I assume I didn't see, even if that's your vision, how in the world is that justified? How in the world is it justified to perpetrate these unbelievable atrocities against babies? And so, to me, if whatever one's position is, even if they're anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, etc., if it doesn't begin with this was a horrific atrocity that nothing could justify, whatever it is that Israelis are doing to Palestinians, if you believe that they're oppressing the Palestinians, if you believe that Palestinians don't have equal rights, etc., etc., it still doesn't justify this. And so, if you have these academics who cannot begin their remarks with this was humanity at its moral lowest, this is savagery, then the only conclusion is they endorse it. They endorse it. And we are seeing very few people take that position. Instead, most of them are exhilarated. They're exhilarated, which means the murder of Jews is the thing that is satisfying them. Um, and so, yeah, I do think for many of them, it is as extreme as that. Let me add a little bit more to that. The ideology which has gripped the academy over the last couple of decades in particular, on the surface, isn't as extreme as how explicit Hamas is in their charter and in every statement and behavior in the last 40 years since. It sounds a lot nicer. It's all about, of course, human rights and social justice and anti-racism and equity, diversion, and inclusion, all those wonderful catchwords, which are the slogans of the very left-wing progressive ideology that dominates universities. But as soon as you get into the details on that, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, just about, if not every single one of the identity groups who are considered marginalized and who this movement is attempting to empower, they are all deeply, profoundly anti-Zionist, which is the sanitary way of saying they hate Israel and want to destroy it. So de facto, this movement is unbelievably hostile towards, at the very least, Israeli Jews. Let's be nice and imagine their hostilities only towards that. But then second, part of the package is this ideology paints the rest of the Jews, the Western Jews, American Jews, as basically white oppressors of people of color who have what they have by virtue of privilege and not by virtue of merit or hard work or desert, to use the fancy philosophy term, not to be confused with banana cream pie, but what you deserve, dessert. And so this ideology, which is meant to empower the marginalized and and oppressed, which is all wonderful and good. Nobody's opposed to that. But in that worldview, the Western Jew is part of the problem, not rather than American Jews are, depending how you count, 2%, a very small minority of the American population. American Jews are like the most targeted for hate crimes of any identity group. Believe me, American Jews collectively do well, but are also very badly targeted by many people. By well, I mean above average by various measures. So the point is, their hostility is not just directed at Israelis Jews, it's also directed at all Jews who they see as white oppressors and therefore part of the white supremacy, which they're attempting to dismantle. And so when they see American Jews support Israel, which American Jews do in very, very large numbers, not 100%, but probably 90%, depending how you ask the question or measure it. There's not a fine distinction there. If you hate Israeli Jews enough to think that murdering them in this way is justifiable, and you're going to look at the American Jews who are your professors, who are your colleagues, who might be your students, the people who, like me, are coming on the air to defend Israel. Well, if Israeli Jews are as evil and heinous as you think they are and deserving of murder, they're not going to think a whole lot better of me either. And so their hostility, if they are not able to condemn this atrocity, if they are not able to condemn this massacre, then they believe all Jews should be dead. And that includes the ones who aren't in Israel. And I don't see any way to avoid that conclusion.
One last question for you, and then we'll wrap up the interview. This is a Christian channel. You're Jewish, but the question that I've got is what stance do you believe that Christians should take on the Israel-Gaza conflict?
So that's quite a question. So first of all, as a Jewish person, I should have no opinion. Let Christians work out their own views and their own stances, etc. So far be it. I'm not giving any advice. And do let me also point out that one substantial segment of the Christian demographic is quite Zionist or pro-Israel. Christian Zionism is a serious movement that's been around in pretty full force since at least the early 19th century, probably even go 18th century, etc. But there's another whole thread in Christianity, and sorry to say, Christianity has a long history of anti-Semitism, which we could talk about another time. There's another whole segment of Christianity which is quite anti-Zionist. So pretty clearly, Christians among themselves are reaching opposed conclusions. Let me just at least reiterate once again, be anti-Zionist and still condemn this massacre. It's logically possible. There's space to do that. And what's terrifying to me is how few people are doing that, right? They're so anti-Zionist that this massacre is okay. To me, that's an extremism that I can't stomach. It's a murderous extremism. So anyway, so from Christians' perspective, they'll figure out what Christianity teaches them. What I would say is, from a Christian perspective, but from a human being's perspective, from a person who cares about justice and fairness and the sanctity of human life, which I hope and believe that describes the large majority of Christians. Again, when you're looking at if we're specifically focusing on the Israeli-Gaza conflict, you're choosing a side that is not only committed to the murder of all Jews everywhere on earth. Again, it's in their charter. And in fact, just this past week, the leader issued a call for global jihad, right? This was a stunning moment. I think it was both of them, Mashal and Hania from Qatar, put out a statement basically equivalent to asking all Muslims across the world to attack all Jews across the world. So this is Hamas. That's one side. The other side is merely trying to defend its incredibly tiny little postage stamp of a land against a world that wants to annihilate it. That's point one. Point two, we should also mention this. It is not fathomable to me. Maybe here's where I'm going to offer some unsolicited, not advice to the Christians. Hamas is no fan of the Christians either. Indeed, one of the many horrific videos, I don't know if you saw this one, there were some, I think it was from Thailand. There were a number of agricultural workers in Thailand who were also murdered, something like 20, that order of magnitude. And there's footage. Hamas filmed themselves. They had a couple of these Thai workers, in captivity, and they film themselves, and one of them says to the other, "Oh, he's a Christian." And then they start fighting over who gets to kill him because they both want to kill him because he's a Christian. And the footage is they have a hoe, and this is one of the people they decapitated. They kill him by decapitating him with a hoe. And they film it, and they put it on the internet, right? Hamas, there's also, I recommend people want to understand what Hamas is. There's a couple of excellent sites. It's a site called Memri, MEMRI. It's like Middle East Monitor or something like that, MEMRI. And there's another site called Palestinian Media Watch, PMW. And these for years have just been documenting what's on the airwaves, both in Gaza and in the territories, et cetera, et cetera. So this is Palestinians, including Hamas, in their own words. And there's one, I believe it was just filmed also in the last week. It's one of the Hamas leaders saying, first we kill the Jews and then we get the Christians, because their goal is an Islamic caliphate that covers the entire globe. I'm not making this up. This is their own words. So what I cannot understand is how a Christian who believes that Christianity is the true correct faith and presumably believes Islam is not, or even if you're a very liberal Christian who believes that, all the different world's religions have something beautiful and wonderful about them. We can be pluralistic and tolerant of other religions. That's a very nice, contemporary liberal Christian perspective. How can you believe that and endorse Hamas, which believes only Islam is the truth? And indeed, the goal is to literally murder Christians to get rid of them, but first the Jews. The Jews come first, right? So I cannot understand how a Christian, even a very, very liberal one, could possibly support Hamas if the question is Hamas versus Israel. And again, I'm not asking you to be pro-Israel. I'm asking you to be anti-Hamas. And you can be anti-Hamas and pro-Palestinian. And indeed, I could make an argument at great length, but I know we're coming to the end. But if you really cared about Palestinians, if you really cared about Palestinian civilians, if you really cared about Palestinian quality of life, the thing you should be demanding and should have been demanding for the last 20 years is the removal of Hamas. Hamas has made Gaza a living hell for most Palestinians. There are no freedoms in Gaza. There's not freedom of speech. There's not freedom of religion. There's not freedom of assembly. There's not freedom of press, et cetera, et cetera. It is literally a terrorist dictatorship that oppresses and doesn't care about its civilians, literally. In fact, let me mention this interview I just saw. It also came out this past week. It's a Hamas guy being interviewed, and he was gloating about the success of their operation in murdering babies and grandmothers. And he says, part of what they did, this was 2 years in the planning, and a crucial part of their strategy was to lull Israel into complacency by getting Israel to believe that Hamas was moderating and really cared about its civilians. And how did that manifest itself? Amongst many other measures, the number of goods going in and out of Gaza was increasing dramatically every month, because from Israel's perspective, peace is good. And if there's some prosperity in Gaza, they should be more peaceful. So the crossings were free. In fact, right as this thing happened, the amount of goods going into Gaza was more than it had been before Hamas even took power. So this so-called blockade was incredibly minimized over the last couple of years. And more importantly, the number of workers' permits that Israel was issuing to Gazans to come work every day in Israel was increasing. It had gone it's already up to 17,000, and they were just in talks to elevate it to above 20,000. Because again, Israel's perspective is if they're coming into Israel and they're working and then they're bringing money back home to Gaza, that's like a win-win situation. The Hamas guy said all of that was a ruse, because what those workers ended up doing, as it's turned out and has now been documented, many of those workers were gathering intelligence on all the kibbutzim, and indeed a number of the workers participated in the massacre. Does Hamas care about the welfare of its civilians? No. Israel does. Israel takes all these measures to make life better for Gazan civilians, and it turns out that was actually part of the military strategy of Hamas to murder Israeli Jews. So if you're a Christian and you're trying to decide, who to, or if you're someone who cares about Palestinian welfare, Hamas is no friend in the Palestinians. You can be anti-Israel and pro-Palestine and should be calling for the end of Hamas as well as condemning this massacre. Anybody who doesn't, the only conclusion I can reach is they're no different from Hamas. They want to see not just Israeli Jews, but all Jews in the world dead. And that to me, the fact that this is a position that is not merely present, but dominant on our campuses means we're approaching the end of the world. That's my conclusion. And it's apocalyptic and dramatic, but I don't see how you could look at the situation and reach any other conclusion.
Do you think this is going to lead to another world war?
I don't know.
Well, because I know Iran is starting to get into the conflict, and they've made some pretty ridiculous claims lately.
Yeah. I'm not like an international relations guy, a diplomacy, politics guy, so I don't have any insider expertise. My imagination goes to I'm a little bit of a pessimistic person. My imagination goes to some pretty dark places. Um, I can see a path to which, yes, world war. I could see a path to which where Israel drops a nuclear bomb on Tehran because it has to, because it becomes existential. But is that likely? I have literally no way of knowing. I don't have
Yeah.
a good opinion. And my one hope is, and this is topic for another time. I just hope that Biden and the United States, I don't necessarily have confidence in this, but I hope that they're putting a couple of whatever aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean. I hope that they are standing up to Iran and Hezbollah and saying, stay out of it, right? Because if Hezbollah gets into it, then Iran gets into it, and then the path to world war seems pretty straightforward. So as far as I could tell, and I'm no expert here, so this is my imagination going. The best path to avoid the world war is actually for the United States to stand strong and say, we're with Israel, and actually we'll shoot a missile or two if we have to. That's, it's one thing to put a carrier in the Mediterranean. It's another thing to actually, engage in combat of some form. I'm not confident America would do that. And if they don't do that, I'm not confident we avoid World War III. But let me just put an asterisk on that. I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about when I speculate in that way. I feel a lot more confident about the other things I was saying than about this.
Okay, yeah, no problem. Well, in any case, I appreciate you coming on and spending some time on the channel to talk about this super important, obviously very, very important issue. So thank you so much for your time.
No, it's a pleasure. And, if people want to follow up, maybe they can contact me through you. I'm happy to engage. I'm especially happy if this would help to empower people who want to defend Israel, but maybe don't quite know how, etc. I'm certainly available. And anyone who wants to find out more about me, I do have a website, andrewpessin.com. If you want to check out that novel, the satirical account of campus cancel culture, you'll find it there. So thank you so much for having me on.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've got your website linked in the description for people that just want to be able to click directly there. So again, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity episode. See you guys later. Again, actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?